Chemical analysis of the stains on the cover of this field journal yields results that modern science can only partially classify. The brown crust that permeates the tanned leather consists of human hemoglobin type A and a complex protein compound reminiscent of the neurotoxins of some monitor lizard species, but with a molecular weight tens of times greater than known samples. This substance didn't just dry out, it polymerized like glue, preserving the pages into a single monolith of horror. We're holding more than just a historical document. This is biological evidence. Evidence of nature's crime against man, which lay in the center of the Simpson desert for 170 years. Modern tourists discovered this artifact by accident. The journal was kept in the hollow of a petrified tree, whose structure protected the paper from sandstorms and ultraviolet radiation, preserving Ludwig Leichhardt's last notes. That same Leichhardt, whose expedition of 1848 vanished from the face of the earth, leaving no graves, no bones, no shell casings. Until today. Official colonial police reports of the time briefly report that the group was well equipped and prepared for the long journey. 7 people, 50 head of cattle, experienced guides. They planned to cross the continent from east to west. But instead of the glory of discoveries, they found something that local tribes call the taboo lands. The deciphered records begin from the moment the expedition crossed the invisible boundary separating mapped reality from the territory of an ancient nightmare. Leichhardt's handwriting in the first notes is still firm, but the pressure of the pen already shows a nervousness that is not typical of this Prussian. He describes the heat not as a weather phenomenon, but as physical violence against the body. Temperatures in the shade exceeded 45 degrees Celsius. The air in the lowlands stagnated, turning into a thick, hot syrup that burned the lungs with every breath. The landscape changed dramatically, as if someone had drawn a giant blade across the earth. The familiar bush and sparse forest have given way to endless ridges of red sand, stretching to the horizon. The geology here defies common sense. The dunes are arranged in unnaturally regular lines, reminiscent of the ribs of a giant skeleton, half buried by time. Leichhardt records a strange acoustic anomaly in his journal. Sounds don't travel here, but fall dead a meter from their source. The clatter of hooves, the creaking of harnesses, and human voices are instantly absorbed by the sand, creating a vacuum of absolute silence. This puts more pressure on the psyche than thirst. People begin to speak in whispers, not understanding the cause of their fear. Animals feel this even more acutely. The horses prick up their ears, trying to catch any sound in this silence. But all they hear is the beating of their own blood. The water in the skins has become so hot that it's impossible to drink without disgust. The metal of the buckles and gun barrels became red hot, leaving burns on the skin if accidentally touched. But thermal shock was not the main threat in the first days. The expedition entered a zone where biological life obeys different laws. In his notes, the commander notes the complete absence of familiar desert fauna. There are no snakes, small rodents, or insects here. The sky above remains pristine, without a single kite or vulture. This is a dead zone. An ecological wasteland that can only exist for one reason. This territory is the hunting grounds of an apex predator that has driven out or devoured all competitors within a radius of hundreds of kilometers. By the evening of the 3rd day of the journey across the red sands, tension within the group had reached a critical point. The sun began to set, painting the dunes the color of caked blood. The shadows lengthened, turning every unevenness of the terrain into a menacing silhouette. It was at this moment that the Aboriginal guides, who had maintained a stoic calm until then, abruptly stopped their horses. They refused to move further, pointing to subtle changes in the texture of the sand ahead. Their faces turned grey with a terror that couldn't be faked. The senior guide began muttering words in a dialect Leichhardt barely understood. They weren't talking about ancestral spirits. The Aborigine spoke of something material, something sleeping beneath the sand, hearing the vibrations of footsteps. His eyes held the knowledge passed down from generation to generation. The knowledge that the line they had crossed was not drawn by men, and that the one who owned this land was already awake. The organized retreat of the guides looked more like rats fleeing a sinking ship than a planned mutiny. It happened between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, when the temperature of the sand dropped to 10 degrees Celsius, creating a false sense of security. The expedition's logbook records that the sentry, the German botanist Classen, did not hear a sound. The natives, men capable of walking across dry branches without breaking a single one, vanished into the darkness with unnatural haste. They took not an ounce of provisions or a drop of water from the communal supplies. This circumstance changes the classification of the incident from desertion to a panicked flight in a state of passion. Leaving water in the middle of the Simpson desert is tantamount to suicide. This can only be done voluntarily in one case, if death from thirst seems a more humane prospect than what lies ahead. Leichhardt was awakened not by the noise, but by its absence. The camp, usually filled with the quiet breathing of sleeping people and the shuffling of tangled horses, fell silent. Upon inspection of the camp, it was discovered that 5 guides had disappeared, having cut the tethers of their personal mustangs with knives. Footprints in the sand spoke of chaos. Deep heel indentations indicated that the horses had been set to gallop from a standing start, risking breaking their legs in the dark. In their haste, one of the fugitives dropped his amulet, a carved bone figurine that Leichhardt had sketched in the margins. It's not an ancestral totem, it's a warning. A crude depiction of a creature with an elongated body and massive jaws, which local tribes call by variations of the same name, meaning Dragon of the Sands or He Who Swallows Whole. Left without guides, the expedition was effectively blinded. Europeans, no matter how experienced, couldn't read this desert like those who had lived here for millennia. The doctor's diary contains a brief but revealing analysis of the situation. He writes that the natives' fear had a biological basis. They weren't afraid of spirits. They were afraid of the predator whose habitat they had accidentally violated. The fugitives headed due east, retracing their steps, not even attempting to skirt the danger zone. It was the reaction of a prey who saw the hunter's shadow and instinctively rushed toward the only known exit. The rest of the night passed in oppressive anticipation. Leichhardt ordered guards to be reinforced and no large fires to be lit so as not to give away the position. The men sat with loaded rifles, peering into the black gaps between the dunes. No one slept. The group's psychological state was shaken. The disappearance of their guides had torn away the colonizers' veil of self-confidence. They were no longer explorers conquering nature, but alien organisms in a hostile environment that began to reject their presence. With the first rays of the sun, when the sky turned a dirty yellow color, the situation moved from the alarm phase to the active threat phase. As soon as dawn broke, the horses, which had previously stood quietly, began to show signs of uncontrollable aggression. The animals wheezed, their nostrils flaring, and backed away from the western ridge of dunes as if they saw a wall of fire there. They refused to take a single step in the direction of their planned route. Their eyes were bulging and their skins were covered in soapy lather. An experienced cavalryman knows this symptom. The horses weren't just nervous. They smelled a scent that the genetic memory of herbivores classifies as absolute, inevitable death approaching from downwind. We discovered the source of our horses' animal terror 200 meters northwest of the bivouac on the leeward side of a high dune. It wasn't a mirage or a trick of the shadows typical of these latitudes. On the surface of the red sand, which the wind had not yet managed to smooth out, a chain of depressions stretching beyond the ridge was clearly visible. Leichhardt, maintaining an outward composure, approached the first print and knelt down to examine it. What he recorded in his journal at that moment contradicted all known zoology of the 19th century. It was the mark of a 5-fingered limb, but its scale forced the mind to seek refuge in denial of the obvious. According to records, the print, from the base of the heel to the tip of the middle toe, measured 64 centimeters. The depth of the impression in the dense, compacted sand exceeded 10 centimeters. Any engineer will confirm that to create such pressure on the ground, the mass of the object must be at least 1 ton. Anatomically, the track resembled an enlarged copy of the paw of Crocodylus porosus, a saltwater crocodile that lives in the mangrove swamps of the coast. But we were 1,000 miles from the nearest salt water, in the center of a scorching furnace where any amphibian would have died of dehydration within an hour. This creature didn't just survive here, it dominated. Leichhardt placed his palm on the footprint, and it sank completely into the center of the print, not even touching the edges. The claws left deep grooves, reminiscent of a pickaxe strike. The distance between steps, a stride or rather a swing, was almost 2.5 meters. This indicated a creature with an incredibly long, squat body, moving with alarming efficiency, conserving energy. The sand along the edges of the tracks was still crumbling, revealing a damp layer beneath. This meant only one thing. The trail had been left no more than 15 minutes earlier. Dr. Kennedy, standing nearby with his rifle at the ready, noticed another detail, which Leichhardt hastily sketched. Between the paw prints ran a wide, wavy furrow, as if someone had been dragging a heavy sack of grain across the ground. This was the mark of a tail. The whole picture, the size of the stride, the depth of the track, the drag of the tail, conjured up the image of a gigantic lizard, a monitor lizard of monstrous proportions, which had just passed here, silently moving its colossal paws. A sudden gust of wind blew a handful of sand into our faces, and at that moment we realized the beast's movements. The trail wasn't chaotic. The creature wasn't wandering at random. The prints ran strictly parallel to our route yesterday, following every curve of the caravan. The creature wasn't simply crossing the desert. She followed. We looked at the decision. Ludwig. Instead of waiting out the peak of solar activity in the shadows, the expedition set out at the height of midday, when the sun hangs at its zenith, turning the planet's surface into a red-hot anvil. This wasn't a strategic maneuver. It was the body's reaction to realizing it was in a confined space with a predator superior in strength and speed. We no longer explored the area. We ran. We ran, maintaining only the semblance of discipline, driven by an animal terror that soaked our clothes along with the sweat. The caravan's speed increased to the limit of the horses' capabilities. The animals, sensing a scent we couldn't detect, tugged at the reins, their lips bleeding on the iron bits. Their sides heaved with a hoarse whistle. Foam trickled down their legs, mixing with the red dust and turning into a dirty crust. The people walked in silence. Conversations ceased completely, as every cubic centimeter of moisture in the body became a strategic resource. The heat was so intense that the air above the dunes shimmered, distorting the view. The dunes melted, flowing into each other, creating the illusion of the earth itself moving. But the most frightening thing wasn't the temperature. The most terrifying thing was the physical sensation of something foreign behind me. This feeling couldn't be attributed to paranoia or heat stroke. It was tactile. Every member of the group, from Leichhardt himself to the last driver, felt a heavy, oppressive gaze on the back of their heads. The pressure was almost electric, causing an involuntary contraction of the muscles in their back and neck. We walked. It felt like the air behind us was thickening, gathering into an invisible lens through which someone was carefully studying our anatomy, assessing the amount of meat on our bones and the speed of our decline. In the surviving fragment of the field diary, dated this date, the commander's handwriting changes beyond recognition. The letter, we are witnessing a phenomenon of collective psychosis, or perhaps our instincts have heightened to the level of our primordial ancestors. We see no pursuer. The horizon is clear for 360 degrees. But I'd swear on the Bible that we're being led. Not chased, but led. The creature is keeping to the dead zone, exploiting the terrain with the skill of a military strategist. It knows where we're going. She knows there's no water ahead. She's waiting for the sun to do half the work for her. I see Gilbert constantly turning around, raising his rifle. He aims at nothing, but his eyes are wide with terror. The horses are going crazy. They feel vibrations in the ground that we don't. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the terrain had changed again. The sandy waves began to subside, giving way to a rocky plateau, cut by deep cracks. We came to a wide, winding depression that might have been marked on maps as a seasonal river. But here, in the heart of the Australian hell, it was just a scar on the face of the earth. The riverbed of the Diamantina, dry perhaps even before the birth of Christ, ran from north to south, bordered by rows of dead, petrified eucalyptus trees. Their white, barkless trunks jutted out of the loam like the bones of giant hands begging for mercy. It was the perfect spot for an ambush, but we had no choice. Horses fell from exhaustion, and people began to lose consciousness from dehydration. Leichhardt ordered the camp to be set up right in the center of the riverbed, where the ground was firmer and the banks provided at least some protection from the wind. This decision, dictated by necessity, turned out to be a fatal mistake from a tactical point of view. We had driven ourselves into the lowlands, allowing a potential enemy to occupy the commanding heights along the banks. Recognizing this, the commander ordered a defensive system based on the principle of a circular siege. The wagons were locked into a tight circle, the horses driven inside, hobbled so tightly they couldn't thrash about. Sunset that day resembled an open fracture. The sky was torn apart by crimson and purple stripes, and darkness fell upon the desert not smoothly, but collapsed like a heavy curtain, instantly lowering the temperature. As soon as the sun disappeared, the unnatural silence that had haunted us for the past few days returned. Not a cricket chirped, not a rustle of wind through the dry branches. The world froze, holding its breath before the impact. An unprecedented decision was made to post double guards. Typically, such expeditions are manned by a single person, with shifts taking turns every 4 hours. But on this night, Leichhardt assigned pairs of guards. One looked north and east, the other controlled the south and west. The orders were strict: shoot to kill at any movement outside the camp perimeter, without warning. The men, exhausted from the crossing, were falling over, but no one complained. Fear was a better stimulant than caffeine. Dr. Kennedy and the young naturalist Gilbert took up first watch. They stood back to back at the edge of the firelit circle, peering into the thick darkness that surrounded the riverbed. The light from the fire snatched from the darkness only the nearest trunks of dead trees, which in the dancing shadows seemed like twisted figures approaching the camp. We lay on the hard ground, clutching our weapons, and listened. We listened to the blood pounding in our temples. We listened to the horses breathing heavily. And we waited for the sound that would confirm we weren't going crazy. But there was no sound. The desert was silent. And this silence was more terrifying than any roar. It told us that the hunter was already here. He had taken up position. He was studying us. And he was choosing who would be first. It was 11 o'clock in the evening when Gilbert, standing on the southern side of the perimeter, noticed how the sand at the foot of the high bank began to slowly crumble down, as if someone huge and invisible had begun to descend into the riverbed, right towards our defenseless camp. The changing of the guard was scheduled to take place at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, according to Dr. Kennedy's chronometer. I reconstruct the events of that hour down to the minute, based on the evidence of the surviving journal pages and the logic of forensic science. At 2:55 minutes, Corporal Hentig, whose turn it was to take up his post, emerged from the circle of wagons, holding a bat lantern with the wick screwed down. The light was dim, barely reaching the edge of the camp, but it was enough to make out the silhouettes of 2 sentries posted at the northern end of the dry riverbed, or rather, what was left of them. Hentig didn't raise the alarm right away. His first reaction was bewilderment, which turned to stupor. He saw the back of one of the sentries, the botanist Klassen, standing with his shoulder pressed against the trunk of a petrified tree, staring straight ahead. The second sentry, a young drover, was nowhere to be seen. Klassen didn't answer the question about his partner's whereabouts. He didn't even turn his head. His body was violently shaking, the amplitude of which was visible even in the dim light of the flashlight. When Hentig approached and touched the botanist's shoulder, he collapsed to his knees, making a sound like a stifled sob. He was in a state of deep, catatonic shock. His eyes were wide open, his pupils unresponsive to light, and his hand was clutching the rifle's forends so tightly that his knuckles were white. Leichhardt, awakened by the noise, arrived at the scene 40 seconds later. The scene the expedition commander recorded didn't fit the mold of military tactics or a tribal attack. On the sand, exactly 2 meters from Klassen's position, lay the rifle of the missing driver. The weapon showed no signs of mechanical damage. The hammer was cocked, the primer was in place. This meant the sentry was ready to fire, his finger on the trigger, but didn't have time to fire. Moreover, he didn't even have time to cry out. The human larynx is designed so that, in the event of sudden pain or fear, air is reflexively expelled from the lungs, producing a scream. Here, however, absolute, sterile silence reigned. An inspection of the soil around the scene revealed a detail that made the hairs on the backs of everyone's necks stand on end. There were no signs of a struggle. The sand hadn't been churned up by boots, as might happen in hand-to-hand combat. Instead, a perfectly smooth, deep furrow, about 50 centimeters wide, extended into the darkness from the guard's position. It resembled the trail left by a heavy boat when dragged across a muddy bottom. The edges of the furrow were smooth, as if compacted by a huge press. Leichhardt's diary contains an entry, apparently made by lantern light, immediately after the inspection. April 14th, 3:15 minutes past midnight. We lost a man. The physics of this disappearance contradicts the laws of mechanics. An 80-kilogram object was pulled out of space with such speed and force that its momentum prevented it from falling or turning. Judging by the nature of the furrow, it was not lifted into the air. He was dragged with an acceleration greater than free fall. I can see the imprints of his boot heels inside this furrow. They run in 2 parallel lines. This means he was standing when he was captured and was jerked backwards with such monstrous force that he didn't even have time to move his legs. He slid across the sand like a dummy. But the most terrifying thing is the lack of blood. Not a single drop where it was captured. Whatever it was, it didn't bite or cut. It simply took him. We followed the trail for about 100 meters. A furrow, winding between boulders, led away from the riverbed, up the steep slope of the dune. The angle of inclination was about 40 degrees. It would be impossible for a man or a horse to drag such a load up the mountain without tripping or exploding sand. But the trail was unbroken. The creature that was dragging our victim had such a strong grip on the surface and such muscular strength that the weight of an adult man was no more noticeable to it than the weight of a dry branch. The headlamps revealed only an endless trench in the sand, stretching off into the blackness of the night. We stopped at the crest of the dune, hesitant to go any further. The feeling of staring down the throat of a leviathan became unbearable. At that moment, Klassen, who was being plied with brandy by the fire, finally found his voice. His testimony was confused, but it contained a key detail about the predator's biology. He claimed he hadn't heard footsteps. All he heard was a sound like a sharp intake of breath, as if giant bellows were sucking in air. Then a dry snap, like a stick breaking, and the rustle of sand. When he turned around, his partner was gone. There was only this rustling sound, receding with incredible speed. And the smell of musk and something sweet, reminiscent of rotting fruit. This description matches the chemical profile of the saliva of some species of prehistoric reptiles. The sweetish odor is a sign of a high concentration of bacteria and enzymes in the oral cavity. We're dealing with a predator that hunts from ambush, using camouflage and lightning-fast strikes. It doesn't kill its prey outright. He immobilizes or stuns her to drag her to a safe place to feed. The absence of a scream is explained either by the instantaneous fracture of the cervical vertebrae by that same dry click, or by the paralyzing effect of the toxin if contact did occur. Leichhardt ordered an immediate return to camp. Standing on the exposed ridge was madness. We retreated backwards, keeping our weapons trained on our comrades' trail. But when we descended back into the riverbed, a new discovery awaited us. While we were exploring the abduction site and walking toward the dune, someone or something visited our camp from the other side. A gash appeared in the tarpaulin of one of the wagons that formed the final defensive line. It was perfectly smooth, about a meter long, as if the fabric had been cut with a razor. Leichhardt held his flashlight to the gash. The edges of the fabric were melted and coated with a viscous, transparent slime that slowly dripped onto the sand, hissing and bubbling upon contact with the ground. This wasn't just saliva. It was an organic acid. We realized the attack on the sentry was just a diversionary tactic. While we were looking north, a second predator, or the same one moving at incredible speed, was testing our defenses from the south. The ring of wagons on which we had placed so much hope turned out not to be a fortress, but a tin can that was already being opened. In the darkness beyond the camp's perimeter, a low, vibrating sound echoed, making the ground tremble beneath their feet. It wasn't a growl. It was the rumble of a gigantic stomach anticipating a feast. We left the camp in the dry riverbed, not as an organized scientific expedition, but as a broken regiment retreating under artillery fire. The decision to break camp was made by Leichhardt instantly, without regard for regulations or the time of day. The clock showed 3:30 in the morning, when the last knots on the packs were tightened by the trembling hands of the drivers. In the darkness, broken only by the dim light of 2 surviving lanterns, people moved chaotically, bumping into each other and the maddened animals. The smell of the acrid, bubbling substance that had burned through the wagon's canvas hung in the air like a heavy chemical cloud, making my throat itch and my eyes water. It was the smell of digested organic matter, mixed with the musky scent that we would forever associate with the presence of death. We weren't simply leaving. We ran, trying to close the gap on the creature that had proven its ability to penetrate any barrier. The order of movement was changed to maximize protection for the core group. In the center of the column were Leichhardt, Dr. Kennedy, and pack horses with water and ammunition. Armed men moved along the outer perimeter at intervals of 5 meters, keeping their fingers on the triggers of cocked carbines. The instructions were extremely simple and brutal. At any suspicious movement, open fire to kill, without worrying about saving ammunition. We realized our only hope was a firepower capable of stopping a human battering ram weighing a ton. The first kilometers of retreat were spent in a state of paranoid tension. Every bush, every rock, every dune silhouette in the pre-dawn darkness seemed like a lurking monster. Hallucinations brought on by insomnia and fear began to overlap with reality. People saw movement where none existed. Hentig fired twice into the void, claiming to have seen glowing eyes at human height. But when we approached the firing site, there was only sand there, churned up by the bullet. This was more nerve-wracking than direct combat. We wasted precious adrenaline fighting ghosts, while the real enemy remained invisible. By dawn, it became obvious that our movement north, towards the saving heights, was being sabotaged. Leichhardt, consulting his compass, tried to adjust the course to bring the group onto a hard, rocky plateau, where the horses could pick up speed and we would have a better view. But as soon as the lead squad tried to turn west to cut the corner, something happened that made us reconsider the entire concept of predator behavior. A low, guttural rumble emanated from the western flank, where the wind was blowing. It was similar to the vibrations of an earthquake, but the source of the sound was localized. The sand on the crest of the dune that blocked our path to the west suddenly rose up into a fountain 3 meters high. Nothing came out from under the ground, but the soil itself began to move, as if a giant drill had passed underneath it. The horses on the left froze and shied to the right, breaking formation and dragging the rest of the column along with them. We were forced to return to our previous course, heading due northeast. An hour later, the situation repeated itself with alarming precision. We attempted to make a dash east toward the dry streambed, hoping to find shelter in the rocks there. But our path was again blocked by an invisible threat. This time it was a cloud of dust, kicked up at incredible speed by something moving parallel to us, but slightly ahead of us. The creature wasn't attacking, it was making its presence known. She was showing us that the eastern direction was closed. This wasn't a hunt for food, it was a drive. In the diary of Dr. Kennedy, whose handwriting by this point resembled the cardiogram of a dying man, there is an entry analysing the enemy's tactics. He compares the creature's actions to the work of a shepherd's dog, which herds sheep into a tight group and drives them in the right direction, biting the legs of any strays. The only difference was in scale. Instead of a dog, a 7-meter reptilian monster acted here, and armed Europeans played the role of sheep. The creature used the landscape and our own fears to guide our trajectory. It knew that in the open, we had a chance to scatter and escape individually. That's why it held us together in its grip and drove us toward a specific point on the map. The realization of this came to Leichhardt closer to midday, when the sun once again began to burn away the remnants of his mind. We found ourselves at the center of a gigantic vortex of events, controlled by an alien intelligence. The commander stopped his horse and gazed long and hard at the horizon through his binoculars. His face, caked in dust and sweat, expressed the mixture of horror and admiration of a scientist confronted with the ultimate predator. He realized that all our attempts to change the route were being thwarted for a reason. We were deprived of free will. We were deprived of choice. Any attempt to deviate from the course was punished with an immediate demonstration of force, a slap of the tail on the ground, a spew of sand, or an infrasonic roar that burst the capillaries in the nose. We continued moving, obediently following the corridor left for us by the invisible shepherd. Endless dunes stretched to the right and left of us, but straight ahead, the landscape began to change. The sand gave way to razor-sharp rock fragments. Ahead, in the shimmering heat, the outlines of a dark massif began to emerge. These were not the saving mountains. These were piles of black basalt and sandstone, forming a complex system of gorges and canyons. The group moved in deathly silence. Even the horses stopped snoring, as if resigned to the inevitable. We felt the space around us shrinking. Whereas the desert had once seemed endless, it now narrowed to a narrow strip of land, leading into the mouth of a stone sack. We saw how our pursuer, or pursuers, we could no longer be sure of the number of creatures, periodically showed a dorsal ridge above the surface of the sand, now to the left, now to the right, correcting our movement. He wouldn't let us stop. Whenever someone slowed, the distinctive whistling sound of sucking air would be heard from behind, and we would speed up, driven by an animalistic terror. The final chord of this crazy race was the discovery we made when we approached the edge of the rocky zone. There were no traces of other animals on the sand in front of the entrance to the wide gorge they had so persistently forced us into. No kangaroos, emus, or dingoes. The land was sterile. But the wind, blowing from the depths of the canyon, carried a scent that made our horses rear. It was the smell of old blood, rotting meat, and that same sweet rot we'd smelled during the night. We stood before the entrance to a natural trap, a natural enclosure that had apparently served as the creature's dining table for centuries, and we were invited to the table as the main course. Leichhardt turned to the group, and in his eyes we read the verdict. There was no turning back. The flanks were cut off, and the only road led straight into the mouth of the devil. The topography of the area we were driven into was a geological anomaly, as if specially designed by nature for the execution of death sentences. As soon as the last riders crossed the invisible line separating the sand dunes from the rocky base, the acoustics of the world changed dramatically. The sound of the wind disappeared, replaced by a booming, amplified echo of hooves clattering on basalt. We entered the narrow throat of the canyon, the walls of which rose 30 meters into the air, blocking out the sun and leaving only a narrow strip of faded sky above our heads. This wasn't a gorge in the traditional sense. It was an architectural dead end, a natural enclosure, the walls of which were made of smooth, wind-polished sandstone and black volcanic rock, making the ascent impossible without climbing equipment, which we did not have. Leichhardt, maintaining the last vestiges of his commanding presence, ordered the group to move forward, hoping that this corridor offered a direct route to the eastern plateau. But this hope proved mathematically unfounded. The geometry of the walls narrowed with every step, and the slope of the ground became steeper. We were penetrating deeper into the bowels of the mountain range, and with every meter, the air became more stale and hot. The stone, heated up by direct sunlight during the day, now gave off its accumulated heat, turning the gorge into a thermodynamic furnace. The temperature here was 5 to 7 degrees higher than in the open desert. It was a thermal bag with no ventilation. After 2 kilometers of grueling marching along the gorge floor, the expedition came to a natural obstacle. A sheer rock wall, forming a perfect semicircle, blocked our path. We were at a dead end. In a stone pit, the bottom of which was strewn with rock fragments and whitish fragments, the nature of which we didn't immediately recognize. They were bones. Thousands of bones in varying states of preservation and age. There were skeletons of kangaroos, emus, wild dogs, dingoes, and even, judging by the massiveness of the hip joints, extinct species of giant marsupials. We stood in the center of a dining hall that had been in use for centuries. The floor crunched underfoot, a sound that sounded like a death sentence in the confined space. Dr. Kennedy conducted a quick perimeter survey, but returned with a disappointing verdict: no water sources. Any moisture that might have accumulated in the cracks of the rocks after the rare rains evaporated many months ago. There was no vegetation at all, save for dry, thorny bushes growing at an inaccessible height. We were cut off from resources. Water supplies in canteens and water skins were approaching critical minimums. Each person had less than a pint of the warm, rubbery liquid. The horses, smelling the water that wasn't there, began to gnaw at the stones and lick the salty walls of the gorge, finally losing their minds from thirst. Leichhardt wrote in his journal, sitting in the shadow of an overhanging ledge. His hand trembled, but he continued to record the facts with the stubbornness of a doomed man. April 15th. We've reached our destination, though not the one we'd planned. This place is a trap, a perfect snare. The creature knew exactly where to drive us. She didn't attack in the open desert, because there we had a chance to scatter. Here, we're all crowded together like cattle at a slaughterhouse. I see the entrance to the gorge, a narrow crevice no more than 50 meters wide. It's empty now, but I know the exit is blocked. We're trapped. The creature is toying with us, giving us time to realize the hopelessness of the situation. The psychological pressure is monstrous. People look at the sheer walls and realize they've become a coffin lid. The realization that we were cornered had a devastating effect on the group. The discipline that had been based on fear began to crumble at the seams. One of the drivers attempted to begin climbing the wall, clinging with his fingers to the microscopic protrusions. He had fallen 4 meters, injuring his ankle, and now lay by the wagon wheel, quietly howling in pain and helplessness. No one came to help him. His empathy had atrophied. Each was locked in their own capsule of horror, calculating their death options and choosing the least painful one. Shoot themselves? Wait for dehydration? Or come face to face with the owner of this place? Late in the evening, when the shadows in the gorge grew thick and inky, we noticed movement at the entrance to our stone sack. It wasn't an attack, it was a guard. Against the bright spot of the exit, 200 meters away, a silhouette appeared. It was enormous. Its low, squat body almost completely blocked the passage. The creature lay on its belly, its massive head thrust forward, and froze. It made no attempt to approach. She simply blocked the only door with her body, letting us out of sight just long enough for us to see her motionless, dark hump. It was a demonstration of complete control over the situation. Leichhardt ordered a barricade built. We drove the wagons into the narrowest part of the dead-end road, turned them on their sides, and filled the gaps with stones and saddles. It was a pitiful semblance of fortification, capable of stopping perhaps a human, but not a multi-ton reptile. However, the physical labor at least gave the men some purpose. We built the wall not so much to protect our bodies as to protect our minds, creating the illusion of action in the face of the inevitable. As darkness fell, the gorge filled with sounds. The walls reflected and amplified every rustle. We could hear the creature at the entrance shifting, claws scraping the stone. We could hear its heavy, raspy breathing, which carried through the canyon like a draft in a chimney. But the most terrifying thing was something else. Every now and then, a strange, clicking sound, like communication, would emerge from the darkness, as if the creature wasn't alone. It was as if she was talking to someone who was higher up, on the rocks, right above our heads. We raised our heads, peering into the narrow strip of starry sky, edged by the black edges of the canyon, and realized the trap had slammed shut not only horizontally, we were surrounded in 3 dimensions. From above, from the overhanging ledges, fine stone chips rained down, and we heard the sound of scales sliding across the stone. They were descending, slowly, methodically, taking up positions for the final act of the drama. At that moment, Leichhardt drew his revolver, checked the cylinder, and placed it on his lap. There were no more questions in his gaze. There was only a cold calculation of the time remaining before the massacre began. Reconstructing the events of April 16th, 1848, requires us to abandon our usual logic of survival. We're accustomed to considering the ground beneath our feet a constant, the only unshakable point of support in the chaos of the universe. Leichhardt, as a geologist and seasoned traveller, made the same mistake. He calculated the threat vectors horizontally and vertically, fortifying the perimeter with wagons and posting observers on the cliffs. But he didn't take into account that we are in an ecosystem where the concept of solid is relative. An analysis of the diary entries made in the early hours of that fateful day reveals the false sense of security that had taken hold of the group. The sun rose to its zenith, bathing the stone sack in a blinding, shadowless light. It seemed impossible for even a mouse to hide in such bright light, much less a giant predator. It was an illusion. The most terrifying of all the desert had thrown at us. The camp was located on a flat patch of sandstone, covered by a layer of alluvial sand about a meter thick. The spot seemed ideal for a bivouac, level, protected from the wind by the canyon walls. The men, exhausted from their night's vigils and thirst, sank into a deep half-sleep, hiding in the shadows of the wagons. The horses stood in the center of the circle, heads bowed. Their instincts, which had saved us before, had failed this time, or were suppressed by exhaustion. No one noticed that the sand in the center of the camp, right under the horses' feet, had a slightly different texture than the sand at the edges. It was looser, as if sifted through a giant sieve. We walked across the hatch beneath which a biological death machine waited, frozen in suspended animation. The attack began not with visual contact, but with a seismic impact. Precisely at midday, when the heat reached its peak, the ground in the center of our defensive circle exploded. This isn't a metaphor. The physics of the process resembled the detonation of a medium-power underground landmine. Tons of sand and rubble were thrown 5 meters into the air, creating a dense curtain of dust that instantly blinded people and animals. The shockwave was so powerful that the heavy carts that served as our barricades jumped and shifted from their places, disrupting the integrity of the perimeter. The horses at the epicenter of the blast were thrown aside like rag dolls. We heard the crunch of breaking bones even before we saw the source of the attack. A silhouette emerged through the settling dust, causing our minds to refuse to perceive reality for a split second. From the gaping crater that occupied a good half of the camp, a creature rose whose dimensions contradicted all the laws of modern zoology. It was Megalania prisca, a giant monitor lizard thought extinct tens of thousands of years ago. But the creature before us was alive, tangible, and hungry. Its body length, from its blunt, armored snout to the base of its tail, which was still underground, was at least 7 meters. It was covered in large, lumpy scales, the color of dried blood and sandstone, making it virtually invisible against the landscape until it moved. Along the spine ran a ridge of sharp osteoderms, bony growths, each the size of a human palm. But the most terrifying thing were the paws. The forelimbs with which the monster rested on the edge of the crater were as thick as a telegraph pole. They ended in curved, black claws 30 centimeters long, designed to rip through soil and flesh with equal ease. The creature didn't just crawl out. It fired itself from ambush, using muscular energy stored up in immobility. The reptilian eyes, small, angry beads protected by thick eyelids, instantly focused on moving objects. Unlike the sluggish lizards of today, this predator moved with frightening, unnatural speed. It was the lightning-fast attack of a warm-blooded killer in the body of a cold-blooded reptile. The monitor lizard lunged forward, its massive head and open mouth crashing into the side of the nearest horse. We heard a wet, squelching sound as the teeth, curved backwards like a shark's, sank into the animal's flesh. The horse didn't even have time to neigh. She was killed instantly, bitten across the spine with the force of a hydraulic press. The chaos that reigned in the camp cannot be described in terms of military tactics. It was panic in a confined space. The men, blinded by the dust and deafened by the roars of the dying animals, opened fire indiscriminately. Lead-caliber bullets struck the monster's scaly armor, sparking but causing no visible damage. Ricochets whistled over our heads, adding to the mortal danger. Leichhardt, who was only 3 meters from the monster's face, tried to reload his rifle, but his hands were slippery with sweat. He saw the creature discard the mangled carcass of the horse and turn its head in his direction. Thick, viscous saliva dripped from its open mouth, lined with rows of serrated teeth. It fell onto the sand and hissed, releasing acrid steam. It was the same neurotoxic venom we'd found traces of earlier. The creature made a sound like a leaking boiler. It wasn't a battle cry, but the sound of air being sucked in. It was sniffing us. It chose its prey not with its eyes, but with its tongue, a forked, purple tactile organ that flickered through the air with metronomic frequency. We realized the enemy's tactics too late. He didn't drive us into the gorge to eat us. He drove us here so that we would come to his table ourselves. He had buried himself in the sand in the center of this rock pocket, perhaps days or weeks ago, knowing that sooner or later, prey would come seeking shelter in the shadow of the rocks. He felt every step we took on his back as we set up camp. He listened to our conversations, felt the warmth of our bodies through the sand, and waited for the moment when we were most relaxed. It was a hunt from underground, a living mind strategy for which we had no countermeasures. At that moment, the monitor lizard lunged. Its body, despite its colossal mass, darted forward with the grace of a snake. The target was none other than the expedition commander himself. Leichhardt, kneeling, tried to pull away, but human reaction speed was no match for the reflexes of a prehistoric killer. We saw only a blur of movement and heard a dull thud. A huge jaw closed, not on Ludwig's throat, but on his leg, just above the knee. The crunch of bone was drowned out by Leichhardt's inhuman scream, which echoed off the canyon walls, signaling the beginning of the end of the expedition. The monster jerked its head, and the commander's body flew into the air like a rag. The dynamics of the predator's attack violated all known laws of large vertebrate biomechanics. According to a reconstruction of events based on bloodstains and the scattering of bullet casings, the contact between the creature's jaws and Ludwig Leichhardt's thigh lasted no more than 1.8 seconds. This wasn't a bite in the traditional sense, where an animal tries to restrain its prey. It was a surgically precise strike aimed at destabilizing the group's leader. The teeth, acting like hydraulic shears, clamped down on the soft tissue, crushing the femur without severing the limb completely. Immediately afterward, the monster opened its jaws. He did not finish off the fallen man or engage in a fight with the armed men who had already begun to spray the center of the camp with lead from all their guns. Instead, the giant reptile performed a maneuver that shocked even seasoned hunters. Its 7-meter-long armored body did not turn to flee across the surface. It simply plummeted down into the very same crater from which it had emerged a moment ago. The sand loosened by the explosion served as its fluid. The creature sank into the ground, nose first, making wave-like movements with its powerful torso and paws, and literally screwed itself into the thickness of the earth with the speed of a diver. 3 seconds later, all that remained on the surface was churned up, boiling sand and a cloud of dust. A volley of 5 rifle shells fired belatedly struck empty air. Heavy bullets, capable of stopping a rhinoceros, only kicked up fountains of dirt, meeting no resistance from the flesh. We shot at a ghost that had already dissolved into the depths of its underground labyrinth, leaving us alone with the consequences of its visit. The silence that fell over the gorge after the cannonade was thick and sticky, like cotton wool. My ears rang and my nostrils were filled with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder, mixed with the nauseating stench of musk and fresh blood. We stood there, afraid to move, smoking weapons in our hands, staring at the ground beneath our feet with a new, unbelievable level of paranoia. We now knew there was no solid ground here. At any point, beneath any rock or layer of dust, death may lurk, listening to the beating of our hearts. Sand has ceased to be a landscape. It has become the enemy's camouflage, its habitat, its weapon. Leichhardt lay on his side, 2 meters from the edge of the crater, clutching his torn trouser leg with his hands. He didn't scream. The pain shock temporarily shut down his nervous system, plunging him into a state of cold, detached numbness. Dr. Kennedy, throwing aside his carbine, was the first to rush to the wounded man, opening his travel bag with instruments as he went. What he saw upon examining the wound made his face turn white beneath his desert tan. The nature of the injuries indicated a catastrophic injury. The torn edges of the flesh were twisted outward, revealing the whiteness of shattered bone and pulsating veins. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the mechanical destruction of the tissue. The most terrifying thing was the body's reaction to contact with the predator's bodily fluid. The wound bled profusely, but the blood was an unnaturally bright, scarlet color and had a strange, watery consistency. Typically, with such deep damage, the body triggers a hemostatic mechanism. Blood vessels spasm and platelets begin to form clots, plugging the holes. Here we witness the complete capitulation of the body's defense systems. Blood flowed freely, like water from a tap, showing no signs of clotting. Dr. Kennedy immediately applied a tight tourniquet above the bite site using a leather rifle sling. He tightened it so hard that Leichhardt's skin turned blue, but the flow of blood from the wound only slowed slightly, continuing to seep through the bandages. The doctor's diary, filled out at that very hour with a trembling hand, contains a frighteningly precise medical analysis of the situation. April 16th, noon. The commander is attacked. We're dealing with a highly sophisticated biological weapon. The creature's saliva is a complex enzymatic cocktail that acts as a powerful anticoagulant and necrotoxin. It blocks fibrin production, turning the victim's blood into a liquid that cannot coagulate. This evolutionary adaptation is ideal for a predator that doesn't kill immediately. It inflicts a single bite, triggers internal bleeding, and waits for the victim to weaken from blood loss. We try to stem the flow, but the bandages become soaked instantly. The wound smells sweet and putrid. The tissue decomposition began before the patient's death. I can see the edges of the wound blackening before my eyes, as if they'd been cauterized with acid. We carried Leichhardt onto a makeshift stretcher made from the remains of a cart and dragged him to the far wall of the gorge, onto a rocky outcrop. This was the only place where the sand layer was minimal, and we could hope the creature wouldn't reach us from below. The group formed a perimeter defense around the wounded leader. The men squatted, their backs to the rock, their weapons aimed at the center of the camp, where dust still rose from the site of the monster's disappearance. No one dared step onto the sand unless absolutely necessary. We moved, jumping from rock to rock, like children playing a dangerous game. Only the stakes here were lives. The feeling of helplessness grew with each passing minute. We were armed with advanced weapons for our time. We had reserves of gunpowder, but we could not fight an enemy that was invulnerable to bullets and lived in another dimension, underground. We could hear his presence. The ground beneath our feet vibrated periodically, transmitting dull tremors. He was down there. He circled beneath the camp like a shark beneath a raft, tasting the blood soaking the sand. He knew his poison had already begun to work, and now time was on his side. By evening, Leichhardt's condition began to rapidly deteriorate. Despite tourniquets and pressure bandages, blood loss was critical. The commander's face grew sharper, his lips turned ashen, and his breathing became shallow and rapid. But the most terrifying thing was happening to his mind. The toxin, which had entered the bloodstream, began to affect the central nervous system. Leichhardt, always known for his ironclad logic and self-control, began to experience delusions. He whispered words in German and English, mixing them into a disjointed stream. He spoke of a cold creeping through his veins, of thousands of tiny needles piercing his body from within. Dr. Kennedy, who had changed the third bandage, which was soaking wet with a scarlet, uncoagulable liquid, looked up at us with hopeless eyes. He understood that 19th century medicine was powerless against a poison from the prehistoric era. We couldn't cauterize the wound with a hot iron. The tissue was too damaged, and it would have killed him with shock. We couldn't give an antidote because none existed in nature. We could only watch as the life, drop by drop, drained from the man who had brought us to this hell. The sun began to set, painting the canyon walls an ominous crimson. The shadows lengthened, turning every rocky outcrop into the silhouette of a monster. And at that moment, when all hope had vanished, Leichhardt suddenly opened his eyes. His gaze was clear, but it held the horror of a man who had peered beyond the brink. He grabbed the doctor's hand with icy fingers and croaked words that made us freeze. He said he could hear them. Not one big beast, but many. Small. Hungry. He said they were scratching from below, just under the stone he was lying on, attracted by the smell of his poisoned blood. And at that very second we heard this sound. A quiet, multiple rustling coming from the depths of the rock, as if thousands of insects had begun their journey upward towards the source of heat. The clinical picture we observe on the diary's pages in the following hours represents a unique document in the history of tropical medicine. It is more than just a description of dying. This is a chronicle of biological transformation. Megalania prisca's venom wasn't designed to instantly kill its prey. Its chemical structure was far more complex and insidious. It acted as a catalyst, speeding up metabolism to incredible speeds, literally burning the body from the inside out to prepare it for consumption. It was a kind of pre-digestion process that took place while the body was still alive. Ludwig Leichhardt's body temperature, according to Dr. Kennedy's tactile sensations, exceeded 41 degrees Celsius within an hour of the bite. Under normal circumstances, this would mean heat stroke and coma. But the commander remained conscious, or rather, in the state his fevered brain considered reality. We see a group, demoralized and leaderless, trying to create the illusion of security. The remaining survivors, their faces masks of dust and despair, began to erect a barricade. It was a pitiful sight. They hauled everything they could: saddlebags, toolboxes, rocks torn from the gorge walls. They even used the carcasses of dead horses. They, incredibly heavy and already beginning to stiffen, were dragged with inhuman effort to the perimeter, creating a breastwork of dead flesh. This decision was dictated by desperation, but from a biological point of view, it turned out to be a fatal mistake. The scent of fresh blood and torn animal entrails only intensified the aromatic signal we sent into the darkness. We set the table for the predator ourselves, adding a side dish to the main course. Leichhardt, lying in the center of this fortified circle, began to speak. His speech, recorded by Kennedy, was not the incoherent ramblings of a madman. These were hallucinations with a terrifying internal logic. The commander didn't see rescuers or his native Prussia. He saw the structure of the world as it appeared to the creature that had poisoned his blood. He claimed the canyon walls were breathing. He described how the rock expanded and contracted in time with the heartbeat of the vast organism within which we resided. He shouted at us to stop making noise because they could hear the vibration of our voices through the soles of our boots. In one of the entries made during this period, the doctor's handwriting breaks down into illegible scribbles, but the general meaning can be reconstructed. April 17th, 2 o'clock in the morning. The patient is showing signs of severe neurotoxicity. He claims his blood is changing color. He sees the veins in his arms as black rivers, flowing not with life, but with liquid fire. The scariest part is that he's right. The vascular network under the skin really did turn black. The poison destroys the walls of red blood cells, releasing hemoglobin, which immediately oxidizes. Leichhardt tries to rip off his clothes, claiming they're burning. His skin is dry as parchment and hot as a stovestone. He begs for water, but every sip sends him vomiting black bile. His body rejects any liquid other than what's already circulating in his veins, turning him into a monster. The psychological state of the remaining members of the expedition was teetering on the brink of collective insanity. Hentig, sitting near the barricade with a rifle, began talking to the dead horse they were using for cover. He stroked its wiry mane and whispered apologies, promising that it would soon be over. People stopped responding to commands. The hierarchy collapsed. All that remained was animal fear and the instinct that made them cower at every sound outside. And the sounds kept increasing. Night descended upon the gorge like a heavy, stifling blanket. The air didn't cool, instead it grew thicker, laden with the vapors of decomposing bodies and the chemical odor of Leichhardt's wound. We heard movement beyond our pitiful fortification. It wasn't the heavy footsteps of a 7-meter-tall giant, it was something else. Thousands of small, scraping sounds. The rustle of sand stirred by countless paws. The clatter of claws on stone. The sound resembled the sound of surf, only instead of water, the waves were a living mass. Leichhardt suddenly fell silent. His thrashing stopped, and he froze in an unnatural position, his back arched. His bloodshot eyes stared at a single spot on the ground, right next to the wheel of the overturned cart. He slowly raised his hand, pointing a trembling finger at the sand. We followed his gaze and saw something that made us forget our thirst. The sand was vibrating, not from the wind or footsteps. It vibrated from within. A fine tremor ran across the surface, causing grains of sand to bounce and form complex geometric patterns. It was like water boiling in a cauldron just before it started to boil. The commander whispered one word, which at that moment sounded more terrifying than any curse. He said, "Hatching." We didn't understand the meaning. We thought it was another hallucination of a dying brain. But then we saw the blood, still seeping from his leg and dripping onto the ground, through the cracks in the decking, soak into the sand. It wasn't just disappearing into the ground. The sand was greedily drinking it up. And where the ground bulged into small mounds that immediately fell away, as if someone from below was trying to break through the shell separating our worlds. Kennedy tried to pull Leichhardt further from the edge, but Leichhardt grabbed his arm with unexpected strength. He looked at the doctor with an expression of absolute, crystal-clear horror and clarity. Brad retreated, giving way to knowledge gained at the cost of life. He said we'd miscalculated. We thought we'd stumbled into the lair of a single beast. But we'd stumbled into an incubator. This entire valley, this dead end, this damned sand, it's a gigantic masonry. And the warmth of our bodies, the vibration of our steps, the smell of our blood, all of this was a signal to awaken. We weren't guests. We were food for the first feeding. At that moment, one of the mounds in the sand, a meter from the barricade, burst. Without a sound, it simply crumbled, revealing a small black hole the diameter of a fist. A narrow, shiny head emerged from the hole. It was an exact replica of the head of the giant who had attacked us during the day, only the size of a lizard. But its eyes burned with the same cold, intelligent hunger. She let out a thin, shrill squeak, and in response to this signal, the sand around us began to explode into dozens, hundreds of similar holes. The floor of the gorge turned into a sieve. The roar coming from underground became unbearable. We realized the barricades were useless. The enemy had no intention of storming the walls. The enemy was rising right from the floor of our fortress. The seismograms we could have taken that night in the gorge would have shown ground vibrations not typical of tectonic activity. It was a vibration of biological origin, caused by the simultaneous movement of hundreds of bodies in a limited volume of soil. We tend to think of the birth of life as a miracle, but in the isolated ecosystem of the Simpson Desert, it felt like a dam bursting. The sand that served as the floor of our prison lost its structural integrity. It ceased to be a solid surface and turned into a boiling liquid. In the light of the dying fire, we saw how the ground around the wagons began to sink into craters, from which, like pus from an open wound, a grey, wet mass began to emerge to the surface. The first specimens to emerge from underground incubators were about 40 centimeters long. Their bodies were covered in mucus and the remains of leathery eggshells, which quickly dried out in the air, turning into a hard, chitinous crust. They were miniature versions of the giant that had driven us here. The same flat, triangular heads, the same wide-set paws, the same beady, expressionless eyes. But there was one difference that made them even more dangerous than the adult predator. There were many of them. They didn't possess the intelligence of a single hunter. They were controlled by the collective mind of the swarm, a unified hunger instinct that demanded biomass for rapid growth. The attack began without preamble or threatening posture. The Megalania prisca hatchlings wasted no time in examining their prey. They simply flowed towards us like a living carpet, rolling over each other, biting their fellows in a mad rush to get to the source of warmth. The sound they produced was like the crackling of dry leaves in a fire, mixed with a high-pitched, vibrating squeak that was ear-splitting. It was a sonic assault, disorienting and overwhelming. The first victims were the horses. The animals, maddened by terror, tried to break their bonds and escape the circle. But their hooves sank into the loose sand. They sank in it like a swamp. We saw one of the mares fall to her knees, and in that same second, her rump became covered in a writhing grey mass. The creatures hadn't killed her with a bite to the throat. They began eating her alive, tearing out chunks of flesh the size of walnuts. Hundreds of tiny jaws worked with the speed of sewing machines. The horse screamed with a voice resembling a human wail until its vocal cords were destroyed. The speed of its skeletonization was astonishing. 4 minutes later, all that remained was a bloody carcass, entangled in sinew, with the cubs, late to the feast, still squirming inside. The men opened fire. It was a reflexive reaction, devoid of tactical sense. We fired into the sand, into the teeming mass, without aiming. The bullets tore through the bodies of the small lizards, turning them into sprays of slime, but 3 more quickly took the place of each one killed. We couldn't reload our weapons as fast as they kept arriving. Corporal Hentig, stationed on the left flank of the defense, was the first to make a mistake. He tried to repel the attack with the butt of his rifle, swinging it like a club. One of the cubs, in a feat of acrobatics, leapt from the ground onto him, clinging to his forearm. Hentig screamed and tried to shake the creature off, but its teeth were bent backwards. She hung on his arm like a dead weight, still chewing. This incident broke the formation. Hentig backed away, tripped over a rock, and fell beyond the line of fire, right into the thick of the advancing swarm. We try not to visualize what happened next, but we must record it for history. The man disappeared under a layer of bodies in a matter of seconds. We heard no words, only a muffled grunt and the sound of tearing uniform fabric. They found the joints of the armor, they chewed through the boots, they penetrated the clothes. This was not a battle. This was the recycling of organic matter. We saw his rifle slip from his weakened hands and sink into the sea of scaly backs. Leichhardt, who had been lying on a raised platform the entire time, watched the proceedings with the frightening detachment of a scientist recording the progress of an experiment. Dr. Kennedy, standing over him with a revolver, shot at the particularly brazen specimens that tried to climb the rock. The commander, overcoming pain and toxic delirium, demanded the magazine. His hand, already beginning to blacken from necrosis, struggled to hold the pencil. But he wrote. He wrote, watching the death of his men. In the surviving fragment of the recording, we read, April 18th, 3 o'clock in the morning. Incubation is complete. We are observing the phenomenon of swarming feeding. These individuals display extreme aggression and an incredible metabolism. They eat not to satisfy their hunger, but to grow. I see those who feed first, growing in size right before my eyes. Their skin stretches and bursts, revealing new, harder scales. We are the catalyst for their development. My blood, soaking the sand, served as the chemical signal for hatching. I am the father of this brood. I summoned them, and now they have come to thank the Creator. Hentig is dead. The horses are dead. Only we remain, driven onto this rock, like rats on a raft in the middle of a flood. The defences had shrunk to a 3-metre radius. We retreated up the rocky ledges, abandoning supplies, water, and hope. The lizards filled the entire gorge floor. They swarmed the wagons, tearing apart the provisions, gnawing at leather straps and biting into iron. The noise was so loud you had to shout in everyone's ear to be heard. But the scariest thing was that they were starting to learn. Their first attempts to scale the sheer cliff were chaotic, but soon we noticed changes in their behaviour. They began to climb on top of each other, forming living pyramids at the foot of our shelter. The lower specimens served as a foundation upon which the upper ones climbed higher and higher. This living siege ladder grew at an alarming rate. Gilbert, the youngest of us, lost his mind. He started hurling burning embers from the fire we'd lit on the ledge at them. The fire frightened them, forcing them to recoil, hissing and writhing. But the fear of hunger was stronger than the fear of flame. They returned, charred, blind, but guided by the smell of blood. We realized we were running low on ammunition, but this legion wasn't. We had about 40 rounds left for 3 able-bodied men and 1 revolver for the dying commander. Suddenly, the movement below changed. The small creatures that had just been furiously storming our cliff froze. A wave of living bodies receded from the stone, clearing a space with a radius of 5 meters. A relative silence fell, broken only by the chomping of those finishing off the remains of horses in the distance. We looked down, trying to understand the reason for this truce. And we saw the reason. From the darkness at the far end of the gorge, the one who had been watching the carnage from the sidelines emerged, his steps heavy and commanding. An adult monitor lizard, the mother of this brood. She moved slowly, ignoring the cubs scurrying underfoot. Some of them, unable to get out of the way, were crushed by her massive paws, but she didn't even notice. She approached the foot of our ledge and raised her head. Her eyes met Leichhardt's. There was no anger in that look. There was recognition. She had come to check if the main trophy was ready. She could smell her venom in his veins and knew the preparation was almost complete. The cubs parted, forming a corridor of respect. The adult opened its mouth and emitted a low, vibrating sound that set our teeth on edge. It was a command, or an invitation. It didn't attack. She lay down on the sand right in front of us, blocking any escape route, and waited. Waited for poison or thirst to force us down to her, or when her children were big enough to reach us on their own. It was a moment of absolute tactical impasse. We were 4 meters above death level. We had no water. We were running out of ammunition, and down below, in the stalls of this amphitheatre, sat a monster who had turned a scientific expedition into an educational process for his offspring. Leichhardt, watching this, smiled bitterly through his cracked lips for the first time on the expedition. He understood the irony. We were looking for new species for the British Empire, and we found them. But the price of discovery was higher than we could bear. Kennedy leaned over the commander and checked his pulse. It was thready and irregular. Leichhardt's heart was fighting the toxin, but losing the battle. The doctor looked at us and mouthed what we were afraid to hear out loud. He has no more than 6 hours left, and we have even less. If we don't figure out how to break through, we'll become breakfast for these younglings. But there was nowhere to break through. The physiological disintegration of Ludwig Leichhardt's body, as recorded in his last notes, represents a unique case in the annals of forensic medicine. Typically, the victim of a venomous bite loses the ability to think analytically during the thermal shock stage. The brain shuts down, protecting consciousness from the pain. In this case, however, we observe the opposite effect. The neurotoxin of Megalania prisca apparently acted as a powerful psychostimulant. He kept the brain alive by artificially maintaining the electrical activity of neurons at peak levels while the body was dying. The commander didn't just feel his organs failing one by one. He was aware of this process with crystal clear, terrifying clarity. He became a hostage to his own mind, trapped in a rotting shell. We read lines written by a man whose body temperature exceeded 42 degrees. At these levels, the protein in the blood begins to clot, but the poison prevented even this natural end. Leichhardt describes her experience not as an illness, but as a metamorphosis. He writes that he feels the chemistry of his perception changing. Sounds began to have color. The smell of burning and blood acquired the taste of iron on his tongue. His vision transformed, shifting into the infrared spectrum. He began to see warmth. In the darkness thickening above the ledge, he could discern the silhouettes of his companions, not as physical bodies, but as pulsating clots of red and orange light. And he saw their fear. Fear had a cold blue tint that crawled through their veins, freezing their will. Dr. Kennedy, whose own strength was failing, continued to perform his medical duty with the mechanical persistence of an automaton. He moistened the dying man's parched lips with the last drops of water mixed with vinegar, trying to bring down the fever. But the water evaporated from Leichhardt's skin instantly, as if it had fallen onto a hot frying pan. In his field report, Kennedy notes that the patient's skin had become grey, sallow, and rough to the touch. The epidermis began to peel away in patches, revealing the inflamed dermis, which oozed a clear ichor. It resembled a reptile molting. The body tried to shed the poison shell, but the poison sat deeper in the bone marrow. April 19th, 5 o'clock in the morning. My leg no longer belongs to me. I feel it like a foreign object, sewn to my body with rough threads. The pain is gone. A vibration has taken its place. I hear the poison coursing through my arteries. It sings. It's a low, humming sound that matches the breathing of those creatures below. I understand them. They're not animals. They're part of a single mycelium, a single root system of this desert. And now I am connected to it. I feel the hunger of each of the hundreds of cubs scratching at the foot of the cliff. They are not waiting for my death. They are waiting for me to mature. When my flesh has fermented to the right state. I am grapes in a barrel, and the fermentation process is almost complete. The psychological situation on the ledge reached boiling point. Gilbert, the young naturalist who had previously fallen into a stupor, now showed signs of aggressive hysteria. He sat on the edge of the cliff, his legs dangling into the abyss, rocking back and forth, muttering nursery rhymes. His mind couldn't handle the pressure. He refused to accept the reality in which 7-meter-tall lizards existed. For him, what was happening had become a dream, a nightmare from which he simply needed to wake up. Kennedy was tie his hands with a belt to prevent him from jumping to his awaiting death. The situation below, in the stalls of our theatre of horrors, remained static, but no less threatening. The adult female Megalania hadn't moved for 3 hours. She lay curled up in a semicircle around the base of a rock, blocking any possible escape route. Her eyes were closed, but her nostrils flared constantly, scanning the air. She knew her prey wouldn't go anywhere. She was conserving her energy. The young, on the other hand, were becoming increasingly active. The cubs, numbering at least 200, formed a living carpet that moved and flowed from place to place. They periodically attempted to storm it, climbing the vertical wall, but each time they fell, unable to find support on the smooth sandstone. The sound of their claws scraping against the stone was like 100 knives sharpening against each other. Leichhardt suddenly demanded to be raised. He wanted to see the enemy. Kennedy and the second survivor, whose name was blurred by a bloodstain in the records, struggled to get the commander to sit up, propping him up against the cold rock face. From this vantage point, the entire gorge was visible, illuminated by the ghostly light of the moon, which had finally broken through a narrow gap above. The scene was apocalyptic. The canyon floor was a sea of shifting scales, and in the center of this sea, the mother towered, like an ancient idol to whom sacrifice had been made. The commander asked for his revolver. Kennedy hesitated. Giving a weapon to a man in a state of severe psychosis was risky, but there was such pleading and steely determination in Leichhardt's eyes that the doctor relented. He placed the heavy Colt pistol in the leader's weakened hand after checking the primers. Leichhardt didn't aim at the monsters. He rested the weapon on his lap and began to speak. His voice was quiet, like the rustle of dry sand, but every word was etched into the memories of those present. He was dictating a will, not a legal document dividing property, but a scientific will. He demanded that this diary, if ever found, be delivered to the Royal Geographical Society. He described the creature's anatomy, their social behavior, hunting tactics, and the chemical composition of their venom, based on his own experiences as a dying man. It was a feat of scientific genius. The man turned his agony into data. He described the paralysis of his diaphragm, which was beginning to make it difficult for him to breathe. He recorded the moments of cardiac arrest and the subsequent restart of rhythm, stimulated by the toxin. He was a researcher until his last breath. Entry from April 19th. The blood has turned black and thick like tar. I can feel it clogging my capillaries. My vision has narrowed to a narrow tunnel. But my hearing has become absolute. I can hear the female below talking to someone, not with the cubs, and not with us. She emits infrasonic pulses that travel into the ground. She's calling to someone else, or something else. I feel a responding vibration deep in the rock. This place isn't just a nest, it's a colony. And we haven't awakened just one family. We've awakened the entire hive. Below us, in the voids of the cast caves, there are thousands of them, and they're rising. As soon as Leichhardt uttered these words, the cliff we were sitting on shook. It wasn't an earthquake, it was a blow from within, a dull, powerful jolt that sent rocks tumbling from the upper ledges. We realized our impenetrable heights were an illusion. The rock mass was riddled with holes and passages, like a piece of old cheese. The creatures couldn't reach us from the outside, along the sheer wall. So they took a different route. They gnawed their way through the soft layers of sandstone within the mountain itself. The grinding sound grew louder. It was coming not from below, but from the wall behind us. The stone vibrated, heated by the friction of the many bodies working in the depths. We found ourselves trapped on a narrow ledge, wedged between an abyss teeming with monsters and a wall that was about to open up and unleash a new wave of nightmare. Gilbert, feeling the vibrations in his back, began to scream. His screams merged with the hissing from below, creating a cacophony of madness. Leichhardt struggled to lift his head and looked at Kennedy. Black foam bubbled on his lips. He tried to smile, but his facial muscles wouldn't obey. "Doctor," he croaked, "get ready. The anatomy theatre is opening. Now we'll see what's inside the mountain." At that very moment, the rock behind Gilbert cracked. A network of tiny cracks appeared, emitting streams of dust and that same sweet smell of rot. A chunk of rock weighing 100 pounds fell out, revealing a black hole leading deeper into the cliff. And from this hole, right at head level, a snout emerged. Not a cub, not an adult giant. It was something in between, a juvenile specimen, agile, fast, and incredibly aggressive. It squeezed through the crack and with a hiss leapt onto the ledge, cutting us off from our only refuge. The barricades no longer made sense. The enemy was inside the perimeter. The intrusion of an intermediate stage individual, we classify it as a subadult, into the perimeter of the expedition's last refuge became a bifurcation point, after which organized resistance turned into agony. Analysis of the damage to the rock and the location of the shell casings, found a century and a half later, allows us to reconstruct the geometry of this battle in frightening detail. The creature that squeezed through the crack in the wall behind us didn't have the massiveness of a 7-meter womb, but it made up for it with monstrous kinetic energy. Its length was about 2.5 meters. The muscular corset was dry and dense, devoid of a layer of fat, which allowed the creature to move in jerks, imperceptible to the human eye under the stroboscopic effect of gunshot flashes. Gilbert, his hands bound with Dr. Kennedy's belt to prevent a suicidal leap, was first in the line of attack. He couldn't defend himself, he could only scream. The sound of a chest being torn apart, recorded in the auditory memory of the survivors, resembled the cracking of dry wood. The lizard did not bite him in the classic sense. He used the momentum of his jump to knock his victim off his feet and, pinning the man to the stone with his body weight, struck with the claws of his hind legs. This was an evisceration technique characteristic of some raptor species, fixing the prey with the teeth and ripping open the peritoneum with the lower limbs. Dr. Kennedy, displaying remarkable reflexes, emptied the remainder of his revolver's cylinder at point-blank range, aiming for the creature's head. We know at least 2 bullets hit their mark. One penetrated the eye socket, the other crushed the lower jaw. But the physiology of Megalania prisca at this stage of development demonstrates phenomenal resilience. They have a virtually non-existent pain threshold. The creature, mortally wounded, didn't stop. It merely went berserk, thrashing around the area, knocking down rocks and people with its tail. His blood, gushing from his punctured head, was black and thick and left chemical burns when it came into contact with skin. Leichhardt, who witnessed Gilbert's death from an arm's length away, describes the scene in his diary not with horror, but with icy scientific interest. His handwriting in this part becomes almost calligraphic, as if the poison that paralyzed his body had emptied his brain of emotion, leaving only pure intellect. April 19th, 5:20 a.m. Subject beta is showing complete disregard for damage to its central nervous system. Even with its corpus callosum destroyed, it continues to function as a fighting machine. I see it tearing at Gilbert's flesh, but it doesn't eat it. It kills for the sake of killing. It's a cleansing operation. A genetically ingrained instinct to destroy rivals in the nest before a new batch hatches. Gilbert stops screaming, his lungs filled with blood. I can hear the air coming out of his punctured trachea with a whistling sound like a deflating ball. The fight culminated when the wounded lizard, entangled in scraps of blankets and equipment, lost its balance. The creature's tail, acting like a whip, lashed out at Dr. Kennedy's legs, knocking him down. The doctor fell to the very edge of the ledge, dropping his now useless weapon. The lizard, writhing in its death throes, collapsed onto Gilbert's body, and under the weight of 2 bodies, a dead man and a dying monster, the edge of the cornice, worn away by erosion, gave way. There was a loud crash, and the chunk of rock carrying them broke off and fell. We didn't see the fall itself, we only heard the sound of it hitting the bottom of the gorge, where the young were swarming, and immediately after that, a change in the tone of the noise below. The squeals of hundreds of cubs gave way to furious hissing and crunching. They pounced on the fallen. The sounds of torn flesh coming from the darkness were so loud they drowned out even the sound of the wind in the gorge. It was the recycling of biomass with the efficiency of an industrial shredder. Only 2 remained on the ledge, the dying Leichhardt and the last member of the expedition, whose name history erased, leaving only the initials M.R. on the magazine cover. He sat with his back pressed against the wall, his arms wrapped around his knees, rocking to the rhythm of the silent melody. His mind was completely broken. He didn't react to the commander's words, didn't look down. He simply waited his turn. Leichhardt, meanwhile, continued writing. His notes from this period contain data that revolutionize our understanding of toxicology. He claims the poison has begun to alter his vision, not only in spectral, but also temporal dimensions. I see more than just heat. I see traces, thermal signatures of events that happened here an hour ago. I see Gilbert's ghostly silhouette, still standing there, bound to the rock. I see the trajectory of the creature's leap, frozen in midair like a glowing arc. My brain has stopped processing time linearly. I find myself simultaneously in the moment of the attack and in the future where only white bones will remain of us. This is a gift. The poison gave me eternity before taking my life. I feel my heart slowing. 1 beat per minute. I become cold-blooded. My body temperature has dropped to the temperature of the surrounding environment. I'm no longer a target for these creatures' thermal imaging. I'm part of the landscape. Suddenly, the vibrations in the rock resumed. But now they were coming not from within the wall, but from above. We looked up and saw that the narrow strip of sky above the canyon was beginning to become covered in shadows. These weren't clouds, they were silhouettes. At the edge of the gorge, 30 meters above us, other adults had gathered. They had responded to the call of the female lying below. They looked down into the black pit where their offspring were devouring the remains of the expedition and prepared to descend. Leichhardt realized that the anatomical theatre was reaching its finale. He tore out a page from the journal that had a map of the area with the location of the nest marked on it and hid it in his breast pocket. He rolled the remaining pages into a tight tube and tucked it into a leather tube that hung around his neck. His movements were slow but precise, like a winding machine running low. "They won't attack us," he whispered to the void, his companion no longer able to hear. "They'll simply descend and take what's theirs. We are incubators." I can feel the eggs inside the female below resonating with my pulse. She didn't eat us right away because she needed to feed her babies. And now it's time for the adults. Below, in the stalls, the matriarch rose to her feet. She shook off her wriggling cubs and let out a roar that caused stones to rain down from the ceiling. It was the signal for the feast to begin. Dark figures began descending from the canyon walls, clinging to the vertical surfaces with their claws. There were at least a dozen of them. They descended head first, like giant geckos, defying gravity. We heard the rustle of their scales on the stone, like the sound of sand falling from an hourglass. The expedition's time was up. Leichhardt looked at his mangled, necrotized stump of a leg and made one last note on the page before turning it over. Hemostasis is completely absent. The blood has turned to black slime. I feel it draining from me, taking away warmth and humanity. But there is no fear. There is only curiosity. What will happen when the heart stops? Will I stop hearing the voice of the hive? Or will I become part of it forever? MR stopped breathing. A heart attack. Fear killed him before his claws. Lucky him. I have to see this show through to the curtain. The shadow of the first descending creature covered our ledge. We smelled a scent stronger than anything we'd ever smelled before. The smell of antiquity, dust, and absolute merciless hunger. The creature hovered above us, holding onto the sheer wall with its hind legs, and slowly brought its enormous muzzle closer to Leichhardt's. He didn't turn away. He stared straight into the monster's vertical pupil, which reflected his own, almost inhuman face. The fact that an adult Megalania prisca did not deliver the finishing blow when its snout was 10 centimeters from Ludwig Leichhardt's face is not an act of mercy, but a testament to the complex instinctual algorithms of this species. Analyzing the last, most chaotic but frighteningly detailed pages of the diary, we come to the conclusion that the venom of these reptiles serves not only as a killing agent, but also as a chemical marker. The female, having inhaled the scent emanating from the commander's festering wound, received information at the molecular level. This smell told her that the biological object had not yet reached the state required for consumption. The tissue fermentation process, triggered by neurotoxins, was supposed to be completed naturally. For her, Leichhardt was not an enemy, but a piece of meat that needed to be left to ripen in the pantry. She released the claws that held her to the sheer wall and, performing a gravitational maneuver inaccessible to modern monitor lizards, slid down into the darkness of the gorge, leaving the dying man alone with his agony and the corpse of his companion. Alone on a narrow rock ledge, illuminated only by the deathly light of the moon, filtering through a crevice, Leichhardt began what police briefings called the last confession of a madman. But we, researchers, see this as the highest form of scientific stoicism. He understood that his time was measured not by hours, but by the beats of his heart, which slowed with each passing minute. He turned the page soaked in ichor and began to record his death. The handwriting here becomes angular, the letters lose their roundness, reminiscent of cuneiform or claw marks in the sand. This is a consequence of the failure of fine motor skills. The toxin paralyzed the nerve endings of the fingers, forcing the muscles to work only on flexion. April 20th. The ambient temperature dropped to 12 degrees. My body temperature matched it. I no longer generate heat. I become an exothermic organism. It's an amazing sensation, feeling the cold of the stone against which I'm pressed penetrate my ribs and become a part of me. The frost no longer makes me shiver. It brings peace. I no longer feel pain in my leg. The tissue necrosis has spread above the groin, and now I feel my abdominal cavity filling with a heavy, icy fluid. It's internal hemorrhage. My organs are floating in my own blood, which refuses to clot. The pedantry with which he describes the disintegration of his own self is chilling. Leichhardt records a change in the color of his nails. They became purple-black as peripheral circulation stopped completely. He describes a taste in his mouth, a metallic copper taste mixed with the bitterness of bile and the sweetness of acetone. These are signs of ketoacidosis and complete kidney failure. But his consciousness, spurred on by the poison, works with the purity of a cut diamond. He doesn't remember his family, doesn't pray to God. He counts his pulse. 32 beats per minute. The intervals between contractions are uneven. I can hear the heart valves laboriously pushing viscous fluid through, like a pump pumping oil. My vision has gone monochrome. I can no longer discern the color red, but I see shades of grey I never knew existed. Every crack in the canyon wall seems like a deep ravine. I see the movement of air. The heat streams rising from the rotting horse carcasses below appear like black columns of smoke. I understand how they hunt. They don't need eyes. They sense the thermodynamics of the world with their entire skin. Next to him, leaning against the wall, sat the corpse of the last member of the expedition, designated M.R. His face was frozen in a grimace of horror, but to Leichhardt he was no longer human. In his notes he calls it an organic substrate. This isn't cynicism, it's a transformation of thinking. Megalania venom alters not only the physiology, but also the psychology of its victim, suppressing the limbic system of the brain, which is responsible for emotions, and activating the reptilian complex. Leichhardt began to think like a lizard. He assessed the surrounding space only in terms of threat and food. At some point, judging by the smudged ink trail, he lost consciousness, but then woke up to a sound. It wasn't an external noise. It was a sound inside his own head. The hallucinations reached their peak. He writes that he hears whispers of the sand, the voices of thousands of unhatched creatures sleeping deep underground, in limestone caverns where the sun never shines. They call to him. They demand his flesh to complete the cycle. He feels like a father who must feed his hungry children with his own body. I must preserve this knowledge, not to save, but as a warning. Humanity considers itself the pinnacle of creation, but we are merely accidental tourists in a world that belongs to them. They slept for millions of years, surviving glaciers and meteorites, and we awakened them. My journal. This is the only proof that we didn't simply disappear, but encountered the true masters of the continent. I see a tree, a petrified trunk, embedded in the rock right on this ledge. It's a sarcophagus. The tree died before humans arrived here and turned to stone. Its core is hollow, a perfect safe for paper. Leichhardt describes crawling toward this petrified trunk. This movement took him, according to his own calculations, about an hour, although the distance was only 3 meters. He dragged his dead body solely by his arms, leaving behind a wide, wet trail of black blood. Every movement brought him not pain, but a strange, electric pleasure. He felt like a snake shedding its skin. Reaching the trunk, he rolled the precious leaves into a tight roll, wrapped them in oiled leather taken from the flask, and pushed them deep into the hollow, blocking the entrance with a stone. He sealed the truth in a quartz tomb, where it would lie for 170 years, until erosion or chance revealed it again. Having finished archiving, he returned to his place at the edge of the cliff. He no longer had a goal. The magazine was hidden, the rifle was empty. All that remained was waiting. He took up his pencil again to write the last words on the cover, on the leather binding itself. These words were scratched with such force that the stylus broke, and the last letters were pressed into the skin with just a sharp piece of wood. The blood has stopped. I feel it thickening in my veins, turning to gel. My heart beats once every 2 minutes. Am I dying? No, I'm changing. My lungs no longer require oxygen. I can hold my breath for 10 minutes. I feel the vibration. It's returning. But it's different now. Not chaotic like when the young attack. It's a rhythmic, pulsating tremor coming from the very center of the gorge. The sand below, it begins to glow in my new spectrum. It emits heat, a huge amount of biological heat. The incubator opens again, the second wave, the final wave. Leichhardt dropped his pencil. It fell from his hand and rolled toward the edge of the abyss, disappearing into the darkness. The commander sat motionless, looking down into the amphitheater of death. The vibrations of the rock beneath him intensified, turning into a low-pitched hum that set his teeth chattering. But it wasn't fear, it was anticipation. He saw the sand around the scattered and looted wagons below begin to act like a liquid. The surface boiled. Waves of sand radiated in concentric circles from the center of the camp, where the earth had risen into a huge mound. This was not the return of an adult. The adult female has done her job. She's secured the perimeter. Now it's time for those for whom all this was started. The scent of Leichhardt's blood, saturated with toxins and fear hormones, permeated meters of sandstone and reached the deepest chambers of the nest. It served as a chemical key that unlocked the doors of hell. The sand below collapsed inward, forming a giant crater, and from this crater, like the mouth of a volcano, a fountain of dust and sound erupted. It was a squeak. Millions of thin, hungry voices merged into a single cry demanding food. Leichhardt, his face already a death mask, slowly leaned forward, peering into the seething abyss. His lips, black and cracked, stretched into a terrible smile. He knew what was about to happen. He knew that in a minute the rock wall beneath him, pitted with thousands of tiny claws, would collapse, and he would fly toward his new family. The last vestiges of consciousness faded, giving way to instinct. He was ready. The biological end of Ludwig Leichhardt's expedition, recorded in the last lines of his journal, represents not just the death of people, but the triumph of ancient entomological cruelty in the body of reptiles. We reconstruct the final minutes based on the state of the manuscript itself. The cover is deformed, and the pages are soaked in that same black, non-coagulating liquid that the commander meticulously described as his new blood. That night, April 21st, 1848, the sand around the overturned carts in the center of the gorge ceased to be a static mass and turned into a living, pulsating organism. The vibration, which Leichhardt felt with his whole being, reached a critical frequency, causing the destruction of the sandstone structure. It was a moment of mass emergence, the synchronous awakening of hundreds, thousands of organisms, whose biological clocks were wound by the smell of his decaying flesh. According to notes made no longer by hand, but almost by instinct, Leichhardt saw how the surface of the desert literally boiled. This was not the return of the adult monster, the mother who had lured them into this trap. From underground, from deep caverns where neither sound nor light penetrates, tens, hundreds of hungry cubs began to hatch, driven by the smell of hemoglobin and a specific toxin. They burst through the layer of sand like black fountains, throwing clouds of dust into the air. Each creature was about 40 centimeters long, but their numbers and collective coordination made them an unstoppable force. They had no individual fear, They were driven by a single biochemical command: absorption. Leichhardt, balancing on the edge between human consciousness and reptilian trance, records the latest changes in his body with terrifying, almost protocol-like precision. He describes how the smaller specimens began to climb the rocky ledge, using their curved claws to find purchase in the smallest cracks in the stone. He no longer attempted to defend himself. His rifle lay nearby, useless in a world where the enemy could not be counted. The commander felt the first creature touch his dead leg. He felt no pain, only a heaviness and a strange pulsation as the cub's jaws clamped down on the blackened flesh. The poison circulating in his veins served them not as a poison, but as an aperitif, a signal for the beginning of a general feast. The last 3 sentences in the journal are almost unreadable due to the author's trembling, but their meaning can be reconstructed. Leichhardt writes that the sky above the gorge now seems to him not black, but bright green in the spectrum of a predator. He hears his own heart give one last straining push, pushing the last of the black tar into his aorta. The last thing he registered was the sensation of hundreds of small bodies covering his torso, face, eyes, depriving him of light and air, but giving him a strange, eerie feeling of belonging to this ancient land. The entries end here. We found this journal in the hollow of a petrified tree 178 years later. It is noteworthy that not a single bone, piece of clothing or button was found within a radius of 100 meters around this tree. The Leichhardt expedition was completely destroyed, down to the last calcium molecule. Megalania prisca leaves no evidence. She processes aliens into energy for her next generation, which will sleep in the sands for hundreds of years, waiting for the vibrations of new explorers' footsteps. The colonial police report lists the case as missing persons, but the pages you just listened to tell a different story. Australia's history holds dark spots best left unexplored. Now that you know the truth about the Red Centre, I'm sealing this archive. The evidence presented in these chapters will remain here, in the silence of a closed fund. There's no point in looking for this gorge on modern maps. The sand is constantly shifting, hiding the entrances to the incubators until the hunter needs fresh blood again. Ludwig Leichhardt found what he was looking for. He became part of the history of this continent, although not at all in the way that the University of Berlin had imagined.